The letter arrived on a Tuesday, written in careful, slanted handwriting that smelled faintly of cedar and ink. Come west. I will provide everything you need: a home, a future, a life worth living. Evelyn Hartwell read it 4 times before she believed it was real. She was 26 years old, standing in a rented room above a laundry in St. Louis, wearing a dress she had mended so many times the original fabric was mostly memory. Her mother had been dead for 3 months. The landlord had already knocked twice that week. She said yes. She packed 1 suitcase, sold her mother's silver hairbrush for train fare, and crossed 600 miles of open country toward a man she had never met. And when she stepped off that train at Blackridge Station, Montana, tired, dusty, and desperately hopeful, not one single soul was there to meet her. That was the moment everything changed. If you've ever trusted someone completely and been left standing alone, you already know exactly how this story feels. Before we go further, if this is your first time here, please subscribe to the channel and follow Evelyn's story all the way to the end. You will not want to miss what happens next. And while you're here, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Part 1. The platform at Blackridge Station was 12 feet wide and rotting at the edges. Evelyn stood in the center of it with her suitcase at her feet and watched the last car of the eastbound train disappear around the curve of the mountain. The sound of the wheels faded slowly, the way sound always does in wide-open country. Not a sharp cutoff, but a long, diminishing echo that made the silence after feel heavier than it had any right to be. She counted to 10, then 20. Nobody came. The station itself was barely a building. 4 walls, a tin roof, a bench along one wall with a split running down the middle. A single lamp hung from a hook near the door, unlit at this hour because it was still afternoon, though the sky had gone the color of old pewter. There was a window with no glass in it, just a square cut in the wood, and through it she could see the mountains rising in every direction, enormous and indifferent. A man sat behind the ticket counter reading a newspaper. He was somewhere in his 60s, with the kind of face that had given up on expressions a long time ago. Evelyn picked up her suitcase and walked to the window. "Excuse me," she said. "I'm looking for Nathan Cole." The man didn't put down his paper. "Cole's a big name out here." "I know. I was supposed to meet him today. I've come from St. Louis." Now he put down the paper. He looked at her the way people look at something they've seen before and aren't glad to be seen again. "You one of them letter brides?" She didn't like the way he said it, but she kept her voice level. "I received a correspondence from Mr. Cole inviting me west. We had an arrangement." "Cole makes a lot of arrangements." He picked the paper back up. "Some of them he keeps. Has anyone come through today? Anyone asking for me?" "My name is Evelyn Hartwell." He turned a page. "Nobody's been through since the morning freight." She stood there another moment. The wind came through the open window and lifted one corner of his newspaper, and he smoothed it back down with the automatic patience of a man who did the same thing many times a day. "Is there a place in town I could wait?" she asked. "Town's 2 miles east. Ravens Pass is west. There's nothing between here and the next station but 40 miles of canyon country." "I understand that. I'm asking if there's somewhere I can sit and wait for Mr. Cole." "You can sit on that bench." She sat on the bench. The split in the wood pressed into the back of her thigh through her dress. She set her suitcase on the floor and folded her hands on top of her purse and watched the door. 1 hour passed, then another. She had enough money for 2 meals, maybe 3 if she was careful. She had not eaten since the train's last stop, which had been 7 hours ago and consisted of a hard roll and black coffee that tasted like the bottom of a river. When the light outside the window shifted from gray to orange, the station keeper finally folded his newspaper, stood, and pulled on his coat. "Closing up," he said. "I'll wait outside." He paused. He looked at her again, and this time something shifted in his expression. Not pity exactly. More like the look of a man who knows he should say something and isn't entirely sure he wants to bother. "Miss," he said finally, "Nathan Cole ain't coming." She kept her face still. "You don't know that." "I know he didn't send word. I know you've been sitting here 3 hours. I know you got nowhere to go." He pulled his hat on. "I've seen this before. Men write letters. Women come. Sometimes it works out. Sometimes it don't." He wrote a very specific letter. "I'm sure he did." He described the ranch, he described the valley. He said the spring wildflowers come in purple and white, and that there's a creek that runs clear even in August. The old man's face did something complicated. That does sound like coal country, he said. He didn't say it unkindly, that almost made it worse. Then he's real, she said. The place is real. Oh, the man's real. The ranch is real. Whether he's still of a mind to honor what he wrote, that I couldn't tell you. He moved toward the door. Wait, she said, and stood. Where's the ranch from here? How far? You'd go through Raven's Pass, follow the canyon about 8 miles, come out the other side into the valley. It's another 6 miles north from there to the coal property line. He looked at her dress, her shoes, her single suitcase. You're not thinking of walking it. I'm thinking about my options. Your options are sleep on that bench tonight, catch the morning train back east, and go home. He held the door open. Or don't. But I'm telling you straight, don't go into Raven's Pass alone. Not in the dark. Not without a horse and a man who knows those trails. Why? Because things happen in that canyon. Rock falls. Flash floods come up fast when it rains in the mountains, and it's been raining in the mountains. He looked at the sky. And because a woman alone out there is exactly the kind of trouble that doesn't end well. She looked at her hands. Her mother's ring was on her right hand, a thin gold band with a small chip of garnet. She had kept it because it was the only thing she hadn't been able to sell. Thank you for your honesty, she said. He nodded and left. She sat back down on the bench with the split in the wood and listened to the sound of his boots on the gravel until they faded. And then she listened to the silence, which was immense and full of wind. She had $6.40. She had no ticket home. She had spent her last real money on the fare west. Going back would require either borrowing from a stranger or convincing a conductor to extend charity, and she had not come this far to beg her way backward across the country. She thought about St. Louis, the rented room above the laundry, the sound of steam pressing down on fabric through the floor all day, and the smell of starch and soap that permeated everything, her clothes and her hair, and sometimes her dreams. She thought about her mother, who had worked in that laundry for 11 years and died of a fever that came on fast and took her in a week, leaving Evelyn with a handful of personal effects, 3 months of unpaid rent, and a future that had closed in like a corridor narrowing to a point. She was not going back. She picked up her suitcase, walked to the door, looked west at the mountains turning dark purple against the fading sky, and made her decision. She was not a foolish woman. She understood the risks the station keeper had described. She had heard about flash floods and rock falls and all the ordinary violence of wild country. She was from a city. She had never slept outdoors in her life. But she had also watched her mother work herself to bone for 11 years with nothing to show at the end of it. And she had made herself a promise at that graveside that she would not live the same way. She had answered Nathan Cole's letter not out of desperation alone, though that was part of it, but because the letter had spoken of possibility, and possibility was the one thing she had not been able to manufacture on her own. She started walking. The road west was dirt, rutted from wagon wheels, wide enough that she could follow it without losing it, even as the light dropped. She walked steadily, not fast, pacing herself the way her mother had taught her. You don't run a race you don't know the length of, Evie. And she kept her suitcase in her right hand and switched it to her left, when her shoulder ached and then back again. The canyon entrance appeared after about 40 minutes. She knew it immediately because the landscape changed completely. The flat scrubland giving way to steep walls of dark stone rising on both sides. The road narrowing to a trail, the air dropping 5 degrees in temperature within the space of 50 yards. It was darker inside the canyon than it had been on the open road. The walls blocked what little light was left. She kept walking. She was about 2 miles in when she heard the horse. Not a calm horse. Not the even clip of hooves on a known trail. This was a panicked animal, the kind of sound that stops you in place because every instinct that has survived in human beings from the very beginning understands that a frightened horse means something is wrong. She stopped. The sound came from ahead and to the right, up a side draw that branched off the main trail. She could hear the horse's breathing now, ragged and irregular, and something else, a low, grinding sound she couldn't immediately place. She stood there for 30 full seconds. She was aware of the dark. She was aware of the cold coming up through her shoes from the stone beneath the dirt. She was aware that the station keeper had told her not to come here. She turned up the draw. The horse was standing against a wall of rock, One rein caught under a fallen boulder that must have come down in a recent slide. The animal was shaking so hard she could see it from 15 feet away. White foam flecked along its neck and shoulders, eyes showing the whites. It had been there a while. The ground around it was scraped and churned where it had fought the trapped rein. She approached slowly, talking as she went. Not words exactly, just sound, the low, steady sound her mother had used to comfort her through childhood fevers. The horse's ears moved toward her. The shaking didn't stop, but it slowed. She got close enough to touch its neck, and she did, and it flinched and then leaned slightly toward her hand, the way animals do when they're exhausted, and something warm has finally come close. "Easy," she said softly. "Easy now. I'm going to help you." She worked the rein loose from under the boulder slowly, watching the rock for movement, aware that the fall had taken other stones with it, and the pile was not stable. Her hands were cold. The rein was thick leather, and the boulder was heavy enough that she had to dig with her fingers under the edge to get the angle right. It took 8 minutes. She counted because it helped her concentrate. When the rein came free, the horse startled backward, and she grabbed it, held on, talked it down. Then she saw what she had not seen before. There was a second boulder, 15 feet deeper in the draw, and beneath it, beneath the dark mass of rock, was a man's leg. She didn't scream, she didn't freeze. She walked toward it. I was lying face down, one leg pinned from mid-thigh under a boulder the size of a small trunk. His coat was dark, and she couldn't immediately tell how much of the darkness was fabric and how much was blood. He wasn't moving. She crouched beside him and put 2 fingers against the side of his neck. A pull. Slow. But there. "Hey," she said. "Can you hear me?" Nothing. She looked at the boulder. She looked at the man. She looked at the horse, which was calmer now, still blowing hard but standing with its feet planted. She went back to the horse and opened the saddlebag. There was a rope coiled on one side, a canteen, a folded oilcloth, and a box of matches. She took the rope. She didn't know exactly what she was doing. She had seen men use ropes with horses to move things that were too heavy for hands. She had never done it herself. But the principle was not complicated. She looped the rope around the boulder, twice, because once didn't feel secure, and tied it the way her father had taught her to tie boats to a dock, a long time ago, in a life that felt like someone else's. Then she brought the free end to the horse, who objected when she tried to attach it to the saddle horn, but eventually, through patience she wasn't entirely sure she had, she got it secured. "Come on," she said, and pulled the horse forward. The rope went taut. The boulder shifted. Not much. 3 inches. Maybe 4. But enough. She dropped the rope and ran back to the man and grabbed him under both arms and pulled. He was heavy, considerably heavier than he looked. And she wasn't strong in a physical sense, she had never been, but she had a very specific kind of determination that sometimes functions as a substitute for strength. She got him clear. His leg dragged through the dirt, and he made a sound, low and involuntary, the sound of someone who is not fully conscious, but is still somewhere present behind their body. She laid him on his back and looked at his leg, badly bruised, possibly broken below the knee, she couldn't tell. The skin was intact, which she understood was better than the alternative, but the angle of the lower leg was not entirely natural. She looked at his face for the first time. He was somewhere in his mid-30s. Dark hair, a few days of beard, a jaw that was either strong-featured or simply clenched. She couldn't tell, because his teeth were set against the pain that was apparently filtering through whatever level of consciousness he was occupying. There was a cut above his right eyebrow, bleeding slowly. He opened his eyes. They were dark, focused, despite everything. He looked up at her with the particular expression of a man who is not sure whether he is dreaming. "There's a cabin," he said. His voice was rough. "Quarter mile. Back on the main trail, north side. Can you walk?" He looked at his leg. Some of it. It took them almost an hour to cover that quarter mile. She got under his left arm, and he used the horse on his right, and they moved like a single awkward creature through the dark. The horse's hooves careful on the stone, the man's breathing controlled in a way that told her he was managing serious pain through deliberate effort. He didn't complain, not once. She found that remarkable, though she didn't say so. The cabin was exactly where he said it would be. A trapper's shelter, old and rough, but with a roof that held and a door that latched, and a small iron stove in the corner with a half-empty box of wood beside it. She got him inside. She got him onto the low shelf that served as a bed. She got the stove going. The matches worked, which felt like the first uncomplicated thing that had happened all day. When she finally turned around, he was watching her from the bed with those dark, focused eyes. "You're not from around here," he said. "St. Louis. What are you doing in Raven's Pass alone?" She pulled her only spare dress from her suitcase and began tearing it into strips for bandages. She had exactly one spare dress. She didn't let herself think too hard about that. "Looking for a man who didn't show up," she said. A pause. Something moved through his face. Not quite guilt, not quite recognition. Something she couldn't name. "I'm sorry to hear that," he said. "What's your name?" Another pause, just a beat too long. "Caleb," he said. "Caleb Ward." She nodded and went back to tearing cloth. Outside, the wind picked up and rain began to hit the roof, soft at first, then harder. In the mountains above them, water was running down stone in channels that hadn't existed an hour ago. She had no way of knowing she was sitting 4 feet away from the man she had crossed 600 miles to find. She had no way of knowing that he knew exactly who she was. She bandaged his leg and his forehead and gave him water from the canteen she had taken from his saddlebag. He took it without comment. He watched her with eyes that gave away nothing, except that they never looked away. And outside, the rain came down harder, sealing them both inside that small and unlikely shelter. And the night settled in around the canyon like a hand closing slowly into a fist. The rain didn't stop. It came down through the night in long, steady curtains, the kind of rain that doesn't announce itself with thunder or lightning, but simply arrives and refuses to leave. The roof of the trapper's cabin held in most places. In 2 spots near the eastern wall, water found its way through and dripped into the dirt floor in a slow, patient rhythm that Evelyn tracked unconsciously while she sat near the stove and tried to think. The fire had settled into a low, steady burn. She had used nearly half the remaining wood already, and didn't know how much colder the night would get or how long the rain would last. She had rationed those questions alongside the food, 2 strips of dried meat she found in the saddlebag alongside the rope in the canteen, and a small cloth bundle of hard biscuits that had been in there long enough to taste like leather. She had offered Caleb the larger portion without discussing it, and he had looked at her for a moment before taking it. He was awake. Had been awake, she suspected, for most of the time since she got the fire going, though he kept his eyes half closed in the way of a man who has learned that people talk more freely when they think you're sleeping. She caught him watching her at one point and didn't look away. "How's the leg?" she asked. "It's there," he said. "That's not an answer." "It hurts. That's an answer." She turned back to the stove. The wood popped once. Outside, water was running somewhere nearby. A small channel forming in the canyon floor, she guessed, or running along the base of the rock walls. She could hear it under the rain, a lower, steadier sound. "You know how to make a fire," he said. "My mother taught me." "She from St. Louis, too?" "Originally from Indiana, she moved to St. Louis when she married my father." A pause. "He left when I was 9. She hadn't meant to add that last part. It came out the way things sometimes do when you're tired and the dark is close and there's nobody around but a stranger who doesn't know your name. Caleb said nothing for a moment. Then, "I'm sorry." "Don't be. It was a long time ago." She pulled her coat tighter. It was damp at the shoulders from the walk through the rain and hadn't entirely dried yet. "What were you doing in the canyon? Alone, in weather like this?" A beat. "Checking a fence line on the upper draw," he said. "In the dark?" "It wasn't dark when I started." "And the rocks?" "There'd been some loosening on that slope after last week's rain. I went up to look at it." Something shifted in his expression. Not embarrassment exactly, but something adjacent to it. "The ground gave more than I expected." She looked at his leg, the rough bandaging she'd done with strips of her spare dress. He hadn't complained about it. He hadn't complained about anything, which she was beginning to understand was not stoicism so much as habit. The kind of silence that forms around a person when they've spent too long being careful about what they reveal. "You could have died," she said. "I know." "The horse couldn't have freed itself. The rein was under the rock." "I know that too." She waited for him to say something else. He didn't. "You're not going to say thank you, are you?" she said. It wasn't really a question. For the first time since she'd pulled him out from under that boulder, something moved across his face that might, in better lighting, have been the beginning of a smile. "Thank you, Miss Hartwell." She froze. It was small, a fraction of a second, but she felt it in her chest, a cold, precise recognition, like touching a stove that you didn't realize was hot. She had not told him her last name. She turned to look at him directly. He was watching the stove. His jaw was set the way it had been when she dragged him through the dirt, that deliberate, managed tension. He knew he'd made a mistake. She could see it in the way he'd gone very still. "How do you know my name?" she said. A long pause. "You said it," he said. "At some point, when you were working on my leg." She replayed the last 2 hours in her mind as precisely as she could. She had talked while she worked. She always talked when she was nervous, a habit she'd tried to break and never quite managed. But she was almost certain she had not said her full name. Her first name, possibly. Evelyn. But not Hartwell. She kept her voice level. "I don't think I did." He met her eyes. His were steady, which she had already noted was his default. But there was something behind them now. A calculation happening, a decision being made. "You're right," he said. "You didn't." "Then how?" He let out a slow breath. "I heard it somewhere." "Where?" "It's a small territory, Miss Hartwell. Word travels." She stared at him for another moment. He held her gaze without flinching, which told her he was either telling the truth or he had a great deal of practice at lying without looking like he was. She turned back to the stove. She added the last of the medium-sized pieces of wood and told herself she was being paranoid. She was tired. She was cold. She was sitting in a canyon in the middle of the night in a state she had never been to before, in a situation she had not planned for, and her mind was doing what minds do under pressure, finding patterns in things that might not have patterns. She pulled the oilcloth over her shoulders and leaned against the cabin wall and listened to the rain. She did not sleep well. She slept in short pieces, waking each time the fire shifted or the rain changed pitch, and once when Caleb moved on the shelf bed and she was upright and alert before she was fully conscious. He was just adjusting his position, trying to take weight off his leg. He didn't say anything. She didn't either. By the time the gray light that passes for dawn in a canyon came through the single window, she had slept perhaps 3 hours total and felt it in every part of her body. Caleb was awake. He had managed to sit up on the edge of the shelf bed and was looking at his leg with the expression of a man doing an honest assessment of damage. "Can you stand?" she asked. "In a minute." She went outside to check the trail. The rain had stopped sometime in the early hours, and the canyon was dripping in gray-green in the morning light, every surface wet and dark. The small channel she'd heard forming in the night had cut itself a few inches deep in the canyon floor and was still running, clear and fast. The main trail looked passable, churned up in places, soft in others, but no major washout that she could see from the cabin door. The horse was tied under the overhang of rock where she'd put it the night before. It watched her come out with flat, unimpressed eyes and blew through its nose when she touched its neck. She checked its legs. Uninjured, she was fairly sure, though she was not a horse person and was working from common sense more than knowledge, and gave it water from a natural hollow in the rock that had collected the night's rain. When she went back inside, Caleb was on his feet, barely. He had his weight mostly on his right leg and was holding the wall with one hand, and his face had gone the particular color of a person absorbing pain without reacting to it. "You shouldn't stand on that yet," she said. "I've had worse." "That is a very stupid thing to say." He looked at her, the almost smile again. "You always this direct?" "Usually I'm more diplomatic. I'm a little short on sleep." She crossed the room and put her shoulder under his left arm without asking, the way she'd done the night before. He stiffened slightly at the contact. Not rejection, but surprise, as though he hadn't expected her to do it again now that it wasn't an emergency. "The trail looks passable," she said. "If we go slow and you don't do anything reckless, you can probably ride. Can you manage a horse with one working leg?" "Yes." "Are you saying yes because it's true, or because you don't want to seem incapable?" A pause. "Mostly the first one. Some of the second." At least he was honest about that. They got him outside and onto the horse with a process that was graceless and took longer than either of them wanted and involved one moment where his leg caught wrong and he made a sound through his teeth that he immediately suppressed, and she pretended not to hear it because that seemed like the right thing to do. She walked beside the horse. Her shoes were not built for canyon trails. They were city shoes, good leather, adequate sole, completely wrong for this. And she felt every rock and every slick patch of mud through them. She didn't say anything about it. They moved slowly. The canyon in daylight was different than it had been in the dark, wider seeming, the walls showing striations of color she hadn't been able to see before, red and ochre and a deep brownish gray. Water still ran in the channel beside the trail. Birds she didn't know the names of moved in the brush on the upper walls. "The valley north of here," she said after they'd been walking for about 20 minutes. "The coal property. Do you know it?" A pause. The horse's hooves on wet stone. "I know of it," Caleb said. "I was told it's another 6 miles from the canyon's north end." "Something like that." "Is there someone there who could help you? Someone I could take you to?" He was quiet for long enough that she looked up at him. He was looking at the canyon ahead, his expression unreadable. "There's a ranch hand named Dyer," he said eventually. "He'll be somewhere on the valley road. We'll find him." "You work the valley?" In a manner of speaking. She let it go. She was learning that pushing Caleb Ward, or whatever his name actually was, because she had not forgotten the moment with her last name and was choosing not to confront it directly until she understood more. Pushing him produced words that were technically answers without being information. He was careful. She had met careful people before. She had learned to wait. They reached the canyon's north end around mid-morning. The valley opened up in front of them, like a room someone had forgotten to put a ceiling on. "Can you ride ahead and let them know she's coming?" Dyer's eyes moved between the two of them. Something was happening in his expression. A recognition of some kind, or a question he wasn't going to ask out loud. "Sure," he said. He looked at Evelyn again. "Ma'am, you got a name I can give them?" Evelyn Hartwell. Dyer's face did exactly what the station keeper's face had done. That complicated thing, the look of a man who knows more than he's going to say. "All right," he said, and wheeled his horse and headed back up the valley road. She watched him go. Then she turned to Caleb. "He knew my name," she said, "without me saying it." Caleb said nothing. "You knew my name last night. He knew it just now." She kept her voice even, but she could feel something tightening in her chest. Not anger yet, but the pressure that precedes it, the way the air changes before weather arrives. "Is there something you want to tell me?" He looked at the valley. The cottonwoods were moving in the morning wind. "There's something I'll tell you," he said, "when the time is right." "And when is that?" "Not here." She stared at him for a long moment. He didn't look away, but he didn't offer anything either. He sat on the horse with his damaged leg and his cut forehead and his carefully managed expression, and he looked at her with those dark eyes that had been watching her since she first knelt beside him in the dark. And she had the sudden vertiginous feeling that she was inside a situation whose shape she could not yet see. She picked up her suitcase. "Fine," she said, and started walking toward the ranch. They reached the main house 3 hours later, accounting for the pace Caleb's horse kept and 2 rest stops where she found water and let herself drink, and tried not to think too hard about the state of her feet. The coal ranch was larger than she'd imagined. She had pictured something modest, a working ranch, well-kept, comfortable. What she saw instead was a complex of buildings that spoke of serious money, a main house of 2 stories with a wide-covered porch, a barn large enough to hold 20 horses, a bunkhouse, a separate cookhouse, and various outbuildings whose purposes she couldn't immediately determine. Everything was maintained. Nothing was falling apart. 3 men came out to meet them as they approached. One took the horse. One said something to Caleb in a low voice that she couldn't hear. The third stood back and watched her with an expression she couldn't read. A woman appeared in the doorway of the main house. She was perhaps 45, lean and direct-looking, wearing a work apron over a good dress. "Miss Hartwell," she said. "Not a question." "I'm May. Come inside. You look like you need a chair and something hot." "I'd appreciate both," Evelyn said honestly. The inside of the main house was warm and well-furnished and smelled of coffee and wood smoke. May led her to a kitchen that was larger than Evelyn's entire rented room in St. Louis, and she sat at the table and wrapped both hands around the mug of coffee. May put in front of her and felt some of the cold from the canyon finally begin to leave her bones. May moved around the kitchen with the efficiency of someone who had organized this space and everyone in it for many years. She asked no questions. She set bread and cold meat on the table and refilled the coffee before Evelyn had finished asking for it. "Whose house is this?" Evelyn asked. May's back was to her. She was at the stove. "You know whose house it is," she said, not unkindly. "Nathan Cole's." "That's right." "Is he here?" May turned around. She had the same expression Dyer had, the same expression the station keeper had, the look of people who know where a river is going and aren't sure whether to say so. "He'll be in shortly," she said. "Drink your coffee." Evelyn drank her coffee. She was on her second cup when she heard boots on the back porch. She heard the door open and close. She heard water running, someone washing at the outside pump. She heard those same boots cross the porch and come to the kitchen door. She turned around. Caleb Ward stood in the doorway. He had cleaned the blood off his face. He was standing without holding the wall, though she could see the way he was distributing his weight. He had put on a clean coat, and he was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the careful blankness of the canyon, not the measured watchfulness of the firelit cabin. Something more exposed than that. Something that looked, she thought, like a man who has been dreading a moment and has finally run out of room to postpone it. "You live here," she said. It wasn't a question, because she already knew. "Yes," he said. "You're not Caleb Ward." A long pause. "My name is Nathan Cole," he said, "and I owe you a very significant explanation." The coffee mug was warm between her hands. The kitchen was quiet except for the fire and May, who had found something important to do in the far corner and was doing it with great concentration. Evelyn looked at him, at Nathan Cole, the man whose letters she had carried across 600 miles of country, the man who had not come to the station, the man she had pulled from under a boulder in the dark without knowing his name, and she felt something move through her that was complicated and layered, and she did not yet have language for all of it. "Start talking," she said. He sat down across from her without being invited. That bothered her, and she noted it, and she said nothing about it because there were larger things to address, and she was trying to stay organized about this. She had found, in the difficult years after her father left, and then in the years of watching her mother work herself to nothing, that staying organized about your feelings was the only reliable way to keep them from doing the thinking for you. So she set the coffee mug down. She folded her hands on the table. She looked at Nathan Cole. She was going to call him that now, was going to insist on that in her own mind, because Caleb Ward was a fiction, and she didn't deal in fictions. And she waited. He didn't rush into it. She noticed that too. He wasn't the kind of man who filled silence with noise, which under different circumstances she might have found appealing. Right now it was just another thing to note. "I sent the letter in January," he said. "I meant it when I wrote it." "And then?" "And then I started thinking." He looked at the table, not at her. "I've had this ranch for 11 years. I built most of it myself, or near enough. Before that I had nothing. I mean that in the specific sense, no money, no land, nothing you could put a number to. I know what it is to want something so badly, you'll say anything to get it. Are you suggesting I'm like that?" "I'm telling you what I was afraid of." He looked up. "I wrote to a marriage agency. They sent me several letters from women interested in the arrangement. Yours was—" He paused, and she could see him choosing words carefully. "Different, more direct. You wrote about your mother, about the laundry, about what you wanted, which wasn't what most of them wrote about." "What did most of them write about?" "Security, a good house, position." "I wrote about those things too." "You wrote about them honestly. You said you needed them, not that you deserved them. There's a difference." He shifted his weight, and she saw the small tightening around his eyes that meant the leg was making itself known. "I told myself that made you different. Then I told myself I was being foolish, and that anyone could write an honest letter if they thought it would work better than a dishonest one." She wanted to say something sharp to that. She held it. "So instead of coming to the station," she said, "you decided to—" "What exactly?" "Arrange an accident in the canyon?" "No." Quickly. "No, that was real. The rocks came down and the horse panicked, and I was genuinely pinned under that boulder, and if you hadn't come along I would have been there until morning, which given the temperature last night and the blood I'd lost—" He stopped. "That part was not arranged." "Then what was arranged?" He was quiet for a moment. I had planned to come to the station. I was dressed and ready. And then I decided I needed to see you first without you knowing who I was. I told Dyer to watch for the train and send word when you arrived. I was going to ride through the valley, come up on the station road, and observe for a while before making myself known. She stared at him. Observe. I know how that sounds. Do you? It sounds like something a man does when he doesn't trust people. He said it flatly, without self-pity. Because that's what it is. May, in the corner, had gone very still. Evelyn looked at her hands. At the garnet ring on her right hand, the thin gold now slightly bent from gripping rope in the dark. She looked at the kitchen around her, the serious, well-organized kitchen of a house that had been run efficiently for years, and showed it. And she looked at the man across from her who had lied about his name and watched her from the shadows and then been pulled from under a rock by the woman he'd planned to spy on. You said Dyer was supposed to watch for the train, she said, but you ended up in the canyon. I took the trail through Raven's Pass to come at the station from the north. I was early. I went up the side draw to check the slope like I told you. That part was true. I check it when it rains heavily because rocks come loose. I just misjudged. You were on your way to watch me arrive, she said slowly, and instead you ended up pinned under a rock. Yes. And I was on my way to find you, she said, and instead I found you in the dark, bleeding, not knowing who you were. Yes. She picked up the coffee mug, took a long drink, set it down again. I have to ask you something, she said, and I need you to answer it honestly, which I understand may not be your natural inclination, but I'm asking anyway. He nodded once. When did you know it was me? In the canyon. The pause this time was longer than any of the others. When you told me you'd come from St. Louis looking for a man who didn't show up, he said, I knew immediately. She absorbed that. So from that moment forward, in the canyon, on the trail, everything you said to me, you knew exactly who I was. Yes. And you kept lying. I kept not correcting the lie. That's the same thing. I know that. She looked at the window above the kitchen sink. Outside, the valley was bright now, the morning cloud burning off, the cottonwood line shining. It looked exactly the way the letter had described it, which she found almost unbearable in this moment. The accuracy of it, the way the real thing matched the promised thing so precisely, while the man doing the promising had turned out to be something she hadn't anticipated. I need to think, she said. She pushed back from the table and stood. Of course. He started to rise. Don't. She held up a hand. You should stay off that leg. I'm not going anywhere. I just need to think somewhere that isn't this room. She walked out through the front of the house and onto the wide porch, and stood there in the morning air, which was cold and clean and smelled of wet grass and horses and pine from somewhere high above the valley. She gave herself 10 minutes. She was not a woman who required more than 10 minutes to understand what she felt about something, though she sometimes required much longer to decide what to do about it. Understanding and deciding were different operations, and she had learned not to confuse them. What she understood, he had deceived her. That was not a small thing, a lie of omission sustained over hours, while she was cold and tired and had just spent her last dry dress tearing it into bandages for him. That was not a small thing, regardless of what had driven it. What she also understood, he had been in genuine danger. She had genuinely helped him. Whatever calculation he'd had in his head about testing her, the night in the canyon had not been a performance. The pain had been real. His silence had been real. The way he'd watched her, that particular quality of attention, like someone memorizing something, she believed that had been real too. She didn't know what to do with both of those things being true at the same time. She put them side by side and looked at them and went back inside. May was alone in the kitchen. He's in the front room, May said without turning. Resting that leg like you told him. How long have you worked here? Evelyn asked. 12 years? Has he done things like this before? Hiding himself, testing people. May turned then. She had an honest face, the kind that didn't do much cosmetic work. Once, she said, right after what happened with Hargrove. He was different after that. Who's Hargrove? May picked up a dishcloth and turned back to the sink. That's his story to tell? Ask him about Gerald Hargrove. Evelyn went to the front room. Nathan was sitting in a chair near the window with his leg extended, and he looked up when she came in with the expression of a man who has been waiting and knows better than to pretend he hasn't been. She sat across from him. "Who is Gerald Hargrove?" she said. Something crossed his face, swift and dark, gone almost before she saw it. "May has a large mouth." "May said it was your story to tell." He looked out the window for a moment. The valley was all light now, wide and flat and brilliant, with the particular brightness that follows hard rain. "Hargrove was my business partner," he said, 6 years ago. "We met in Billings when I was first building this operation. I had the land and the cattle, but not the capital to expand. He came in with money and with contracts, and he was persuasive in the way that certain men are persuasive, where you don't notice you've agreed to something until you're already past the point of easily disagreeing." A pause. "Over 2 years, he shifted the deed structures on 3 parcels of the property into his name, gradually. Small changes each time. By the time I understood what had happened, he had legal claim to nearly a third of the ranch." "What did you do?" "Fought it in court for 18 months and got most of it back. But the fighting cost money, and the cost wasn't only money." He looked at his hands. "He was a friend. I thought he was a friend. I'd had him in this house, at this table, for 2 years. After that," he stopped, started again. "After that, I became careful." "Careful," she said. "Or closed." He looked at her. "There's a difference," she said. "Careful means you watch for genuine warning signs. Closed means you decide everyone is Hargrove until proven otherwise." He didn't answer that immediately, which she took to mean it had landed. "My attorney suggested the letter arrangement," he said. "He thought it would be stabilizing. That's the word he used. He thought having someone on the ranch who was there by choice rather than by wage might—" He stopped again. "I agreed because I was tired of eating alone, which is about as unromantic a reason for seeking a wife as a man can have. But there it is." She almost smiled. She stopped herself because she wasn't ready to smile at him yet. "So you wrote to the agency," she said. "You picked my letter." "Yes." "And then you decided to observe me before committing." "Yes." "And then you ended up under a rock." "Yes." He looked at her with something that was not quite self-deprecation, but was in that neighborhood. Certain people might call that a consequence. Certain people would be right. She sat back in her chair. "Nathan, I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to actually hear it and not just respond to it. All right? I didn't come out here for your ranch. I'll be honest. The security mattered because I was in a situation where the alternative was poverty. And I've watched poverty work on a person for 11 years, and I wanted something different. But I came because the letter sounded like someone speaking plainly, and I have spent most of my life around people who don't speak plainly, and I am very tired of it." She met his eyes. "And then I arrived and you weren't there, and I had a choice between the bench at that train station and walking into the dark, and I walked into the dark because I was not going to sit and wait for someone else to decide my future for me. And I pulled you out of those rocks because you needed to be pulled out, and you were a human person who was going to die if I didn't. Not because I knew who you were, not because I wanted something from you." He was very still. "I know," he said. "I don't think you do," she said. "Not entirely, because if you knew it entirely, you would have told me your name the moment I got that fire going." That sat in the room between them. Outside, a horse crossed the yard at a trot. She could hear men's voices somewhere near the barn, the ordinary sounds of a working ranch coming back to life after the morning. "You're right," he said. She nodded. "I'm going to need a few days. I need to sleep and eat and get the mud off my shoes and figure out where I stand. Not here, necessarily. If you have somewhere I can—" "You'll stay here," he said, and then caught himself. "If you're willing. There are 3 rooms upstairs. May will show you. You're not obligated to— I'm not expecting—" He stopped. The careful, managed man was having trouble with this sentence. "I would like you to stay." She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back. He didn't add anything, which she was beginning to understand was as close as he got to showing vulnerability. He stopped talking and let the thing stand without buttressing it. "I'll stay a few days," she said. "That's all I'm committing to." "That's enough," he said. It wasn't enough. Both of them knew that. But it was what they had, and she was too tired to pretend otherwise. May showed her to a room on the 2nd floor that faced east over the valley. It had a real bed with a quilted cover and a washstand with a ceramic pitcher and a window that framed the mountain line against the sky. It was the nicest room Evelyn had slept in since before her father left, which was a long time ago, and she didn't let herself feel too much about that because she was still making decisions about this place and this man, and she needed to stay clear. She slept for 5 hours. When she woke, the light through the window was afternoon orange, and the house was quiet, and she lay there for a few minutes just listening. Then she got up and washed her face and went downstairs. She spent the rest of that first day mostly with May, who showed her the kitchen and the garden and the layout of the house with a practicality that Evelyn appreciated. May didn't push conversation. She offered information when it was useful and left space when it wasn't, and Evelyn found herself relaxing into the kitchen's warmth in a way she hadn't expected. Nathan kept his distance. She saw him once in the late afternoon, crossing the yard toward the barn, with a slight hitch in his walk that would probably be there for weeks. He didn't look up at the house. She stood at the window and watched him go. The second day was different. She was up early, old habit from the laundry, where the steam started before dawn, and she was in the kitchen when he came down. May wasn't in yet. He stopped in the doorway when he saw her. "Coffee's made," she said. He came in and poured a cup and stood at the counter and didn't try to start anything. She sat at the table with her own cup and they were quiet together for a few minutes, which was less uncomfortable than she'd expected. "Can you show me the property today?" she said. That he looked at her. "I want to know what's here," she said. "What the ranch actually is. Not as a calculation. I just want to understand what I'm looking at. My leg. Can you ride?" He considered. "Yes." "Then show me." They spent 4 hours on horseback moving across the Cole property, and she saw things she had not imagined from the letter. The scope of it, the distances involved, the different types of land within the same holding, the creek with its willows and its cold running water, the upper meadows where the cattle were moved in summer. He talked about the ranch the way people talk about things they have built with their hands over a long time. Precisely, without sentiment, but with the precision that is its own kind of love. She asked questions, practical ones. How many head of cattle? What the hired men earned and whether they were paid on time, which he answered without defensiveness, which told her something. What happened in a drought year? Whether the water rights were documented and held solely by him, and she watched his expression when she said that, watched him understand that she knew about Hargrove and was asking the real question underneath the question. "The water rights are clean," he said. "I had everything restructured after the lawsuit. Every deed, every water claim, every boundary line. I have 4 copies in 3 different locations." "Good," she said. On the ride back, they were quiet for a long stretch. The late afternoon light was doing what light does in that country, going gold and long, hitting the grass at an angle that made everything look like something you'd want to remember. "Why did you say yes to the letter arrangement?" he asked. She could hear he'd been holding it for a while. "I already told you I needed—" "You told me about the security," he said, "and the part about plain speaking. I believed both of those. But why marriage? You're not— You seem like someone who could find work, find another way to manage. You didn't have to agree to come to a stranger." She looked at the mountains. The honest answer was one she hadn't said out loud to anyone, because it sounded like something she should be embarrassed about, and she hadn't yet decided whether she was. "My mother died loving someone who wasn't there," she said. "She spent 11 years talking about my father as though he might still come back, even after it was obvious he wouldn't. She gave everything she had to a story that wasn't real, and she died of it, basically." She paused. "I didn't want that. I thought, if I go into something clearly, with terms both people understand, with no story being told, then at least I'd know what I was in, no illusions." He rode beside her without speaking for a while. "That's a very practical reason," he said. "I'm a practical person." "You are," he said. "You're also—" He stopped. "What?" "You're also more than that," he said. "In the cabin, when you were tearing up your dress for bandages, you weren't being practical then. That was something else." She didn't answer. The ranch buildings came back into view ahead of them, smoke rising from the cookhouse chimney. "Nathan," she said. "Yes. If I decide to stay, and I haven't decided, I need you to understand something." "All right. No more tests, no more watching from the outside to see what I'll do when I don't know I'm being watched." She kept her eyes on the buildings ahead. Whatever you need to know about me, you ask directly, and I'll answer directly. But you do not get to run experiments on me like I'm something to be assessed. I'm a person, not a test subject. He was quiet for long enough that she turned to look at him. Agreed, he said. His voice was even, but something in it was not. And you don't lie to me again, about anything. Agreed. I mean it. I know you do. He met her eyes. I know. She turned back to the buildings, and they rode the rest of the way in silence, and she sat in the saddle and felt the cold air off the mountain coming down across the valley and tried to measure what she was feeling against what she could afford to feel. She hadn't decided yet. That part was true. But she had stopped wanting to leave, and that was its own kind of information, and she tucked it away carefully to examine later when she was alone. They unsaddled the horses together at the barn, or she did most of it while he worked around the limits of his leg, with the stubborn practicality of a man who refuses to stand idle. And when she came out of the barn with the saddle over her arm, she nearly ran into May, who was crossing the yard with a basket of linens and did not appear remotely surprised to see either of them. "Supper's at 6, May said, and kept walking. Evelyn watched her go. She could feel Nathan behind her, not close, not presumptuously close, just present in the way he was generally present, steady and watchful and not entirely comfortable but not performing comfort either. "She's been running this house for 12 years, he said. "I know," Evelyn said. "You mentioned. She's seen everything that's happened here, including Hargrove, including everything after." Evelyn turned. "Why are you telling me that?" "Because she likes you," he said. "She hasn't liked anyone I've brought onto this property in a long time. And May's judgment is better than mine, which I've known for years and tried to ignore." He looked slightly pained by his own honesty, as though it was physical effort. "I thought you should know." She looked at him for a moment. The afternoon light was behind him, cutting across the yard, and he looked like what he was, a difficult man in a place he had built with difficulty, who had made poor choices out of fear and was trying to figure out how to say so without making it worse. She thought about her mother, about choosing a story that wasn't real and living inside it until there was nothing left. She thought about the cabin in the dark, the fire, the way he had watched her like someone memorizing something they were afraid of losing. She picked up the saddle she'd set down. 6 o'clock, she said, and carried it into the barn. She was aware, walking away, that he watched her go. She was aware that she didn't mind. That was the most alarming thing yet, and she filed it carefully alongside everything else she wasn't ready to examine, and she went in to wash up for supper in a house that was not hers, in a valley she had arrived at by accident and stubbornness and a wrong turn in the dark. And she stood at the washstand and looked at her own face in the small mirror above it, and told herself firmly that she had not decided anything. Her reflection didn't look entirely convinced. Supper that first evening was not easy. May had cooked a proper meal: roasted chicken, potatoes, bread that was still warm from the oven. And the three of them sat at the long kitchen table in an arrangement that was not quite comfortable and not quite awkward, somewhere in the narrow territory between those two things. Dyer had been invited but declined, which Evelyn suspected was May's doing, some quiet management of the situation that she was grateful for without knowing exactly why. Nathan ate with the focused efficiency of a man who was raised to finish what was on his plate and didn't think much about meals as social occasions. May ate with the particular composure of a woman who had presided over too many uncomfortable dinners to be bothered by this one. Evelyn ate because she hadn't had a real meal in 2 days, and her body had stopped being polite about that. The conversation was practical. Nathan asked about her journey, the train from St. Louis, the stops, whether the connections had been reliable. She answered. She asked about the ranch's winter operations. He answered. May occasionally inserted a piece of information about one or the other topic, as though she were laying bricks in a wall, steadily and without drama, and Evelyn recognized the technique and was quietly grateful for it. After supper, Nathan excused himself to the front room, and she helped May clear the table, which wasn't asked for or expected, but which she needed to do because she was not a person who sat while work was happening in front of her. "He's not easy company," May said at the sink. "I noticed. He's better than he used to be. After Hargrove, he barely spoke to anyone for 6 months. The men thought he'd sell the ranch. He didn't. He just compressed. Got very small inside all this space." She handed Evelyn a plate to dry. "He started breathing again about a year ago, slowly. Evelyn dried the plate. Why are you telling me this? Because you're trying to understand him, and you're being sensible about it. And sensible people need information. May handed her another plate. He's not going to tell you himself. Not the shape of it. He'll tell you facts. Hargrove's name, the lawsuit, the years. He won't tell you what it did to him. What did it do to him? May was quiet for a moment. Made him distrust his own judgment, which is hard for a man like him because his judgment is generally excellent. He trusted Hargrove completely, and Hargrove used that completely. So now She paused. He checks everything twice. He doesn't decide quickly anymore, and he keeps the distance in, like a buffer. Evelyn set the dried plate on the shelf. The letter arrangement, she said. He told me his attorney suggested it. His attorney suggested it. He agreed because he wanted to. May looked at her. He wrote 6 letters before he sent yours. I watched him work on them. Threw each one away. Yours went out in January without him stopping to second-guess it, which for him is the equivalent of a large decision made very fast. Evelyn thought about that. She went up to her room and lay on the quilted bed in the dark, and listened to the house settle around her, and told herself she was still deciding, which was true, but she was beginning to understand that the decision had already started forming in some part of her that didn't ask permission. In the morning, she found Nathan in the study, which was the room between the kitchen and the front parlor. A working room, a desk with ledgers and correspondence, and a bookshelf that was not decorative but used, the spines creased, and some of the books held shut with tucked paper. He was going through a stack of papers with the systematic attention of someone who had been doing this for hours. She stood in the doorway. Can I ask what you're doing? He looked up. He looked like he'd slept badly, which she suspected was true, and he had the particular wariness of someone who has prepared for a difficult morning and isn't sure when it's going to arrive. Monthly accounts, he said. The billing supply run is next week. I need to have the orders ready. She looked at the desk. The ledgers were open, the columns handwritten, numbers running down each page. Can I look? He hesitated. A brief, visible hesitation that she watched and noted, and then he pushed the closest ledger toward her. She came to the desk and stood beside it and read through the current page. She had done her mother's account since she was 14, and she had a particular facility with numbers that her mother called a gift, and she called just paying attention. She scanned down the columns. Your feed costs are high, she said. He looked at the page. It was a dry summer. Hay prices went up. I understand, but you're paying Connolly Brothers in Billings. There's a supplier in Miles City that runs lower. I read about it in a railroad bulletin on the train. 12 cents a bale lower, and the quality is comparable. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. You read railroad bulletins, he said. I read everything available to me. I was on a train for 3 days. She straightened. I'm not telling you how to run your ranch. I'm telling you what I noticed. I'm not offended, he said. He stopped. I wasn't expecting that. What were you expecting? He looked back at the ledger. I don't know. Not that. She went back to her room and got her coat, because the study had a draft from the west window, and she was already cold enough from 2 days of bad sleep and not enough food. When she came back, Nathan had the ledger pulled closer and was comparing figures on 2 separate pages, and he looked up when she sat down in the chair across from the desk. How did you learn to read accounts? He asked. My mother couldn't after a while. Her eyes went bad and she wouldn't admit it, so I did it. How old were you? 14. She paused. She also couldn't negotiate with the laundry owner over her wage because he was a man and she was nervous around men who had authority over her situation. So I did that too. He set the pen down. At 14. He was not pleased. She allowed herself a small thing that was almost a smile. He was less pleased when I brought her wage up by 30 cents a week. But he did it. Nathan looked at her for a long moment. You're not what I expected, he said. From the letter. What did you expect? He thought about it. Someone more tentative. Someone who'd be grateful to be here and trying to please. I am grateful to be here, she said, and I am trying, just not in that particular way. He nodded slowly. He looked, she thought, like a man who had built a very specific room in his mind and was now discovering that the person who'd arrived required an entirely different kind of space. She didn't know whether that was a problem for him. She was beginning to care less about managing that particular uncertainty. They developed a rhythm over the following days that she hadn't planned for and hadn't expected. She didn't know what she'd anticipated, a kind of careful formality, probably, both of them moving around each other the way people do in uncertain situations, measuring distance and keeping it. But the ranch was a working place, and working places have their own logic that tends to override social discomfort, and she found herself drawn into the operation of it almost without deciding to be. She helped May with the house, not because it was expected, but because she couldn't sit idle, and the garden needed weeding, and the root cellar needed inventorying, and those were things she could do without anyone having to manage her. She rode out with Nathan twice more in those first days, once to the eastern boundary where a section of fence needed assessment, and once to the upper meadow where the last of the summer cattle were being brought down before the hard weather came. She watched how he worked with the men. There were 6 hired hands on the ranch full-time, with more brought in at peak seasons. He knew all of their names and their particular capabilities, and he didn't manage them through volume or display, but through a quiet precision that she recognized as the same thing that made him impossible to read in conversation. He said what needed doing and trusted them to do it, and was there if they needed him. They respected him. She could see that, with the specific respect that comes from earned trust rather than hierarchy. On the 4th evening, it rained again, and the 3 of them sat in the front room after supper. Nathan with a newspaper, May with her mending, Evelyn with one of the creased books she'd pulled from the study shelf without asking, which was a history of the Montana territorial government, which was not the most gripping reading she'd encountered, but was better than sitting with her hands still. The fire was good, and the rain was on the roof, and after a while the sound of it stopped being something she was aware of, and just became the room. She looked up at some point and found Nathan watching her over the top of his newspaper. He looked away immediately, with the practiced ease of a man who'd been caught and wasn't going to acknowledge it. She went back to the book. Later, after May had gone to bed, Evelyn closed the book and set it on the end table and looked at the fire, and Nathan folded the newspaper with the neat final movements of someone wrapping up the evening. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes?" "What do you want from this arrangement?" She looked at him directly. "Not what you put in the letter. Not what the agency suggested or what your attorney recommended. What you actually want." I was quiet for what she was beginning to recognize as his real thinking time. Not the performed pause of a man deciding what to say, but the actual working time of someone who takes questions seriously. "I want the ranch to outlast me," he said finally. "I've spent 11 years building it, and I've done it mostly alone, and I know that something you build alone doesn't persist the way something built with another person does. Not because I need help building it, because without someone to build it for, the reason for it gets thin." He looked at the fire. "I want someone at this table who's here because they chose to be, not because of the wage." She let that settle. "And the part where it's a marriage?" she said. "Not a business arrangement, the actual personal part of it." He was quiet again, longer this time. "I'm not good at that part," he said. "I'm aware of that. I don't come easily to it. I close up when I should open, and I speak precisely when I should speak plainly, and I test people when I should just trust them, which I know because you've told me, and you're right." He looked at his hands. "But I'm not indifferent to it. That's what I can tell you honestly. I'm not indifferent." She sat with that. Outside, the rain shifted in tone, lighter, almost finished. "I'm not easy either," she said. "I need you to know that. I'm direct in ways that some people find difficult. I won't agree with you to make things smooth. If I think you're wrong, I'll tell you." She looked at the fire. "My mother spent her life accommodating other people, and it hollowed her out. I decided a long time ago I wasn't going to do that, which means I can be—" She paused. "Not easy." "I don't want easy," he said. She looked at him. "I've had easy," he said. "Easy is what Hargrove looked like for 2 years. Everything smooth, everything agreeable, no friction anywhere." He met her eyes. Easy should have been the warning. She held his gaze for a moment, then she looked back at the fire. "I'm going to stay," she said. "Past the few days I agreed to. I haven't decided about the arrangement long term, but I'm not leaving." He said nothing. She could feel the change in him from where she sat. Some held thing releasing, very slightly, the way a rope goes marginally slack when the weight it's bearing shifts. "All right," he said, "and in the morning I want to look at the rest of those accounts. The Cattlemen's Association records. You're paying a membership assessment that looks high for the size of your herd. A pause. Then, quietly, all right. She got up and said goodnight and went upstairs, and she lay in the east-facing room and listened to the last of the rain and felt, for the first time since she'd stepped off the train at Blackridge Station, that she was somewhere she might be allowed to rest. It was a strange and cautious feeling. She treated able to predict. Not smooth. She had said she wasn't easy, and she'd meant it, and there were days when she and Nathan came into direct collision over things, small things mostly, the kinds of friction that form when two people with strong habits begin sharing a space. He had a way of making decisions about the ranch without informing anyone that she found maddening, not because the decisions were wrong, but because the silence around them felt like the same instinct that had kept him watching her from the shadows in Raven's Pass. She told him so. It was not a gentle conversation. He listened without defending himself, which was worse in a way than if he'd argued, because it meant she had to sit with the things she'd said rather than spend her energy on his response. "You're right," he said when she was finished. "I do that. I decide and then inform. I'm not sure I know how to do it the other way." "Try," she said. "I'm not asking to be consulted on every fence post. I'm asking that when something affects the operation we're both living in, you tell me before you've already committed." "We're both living in," he repeated, and she heard what she'd said and didn't take it back. "Yes," she said, "we're both living in." After that he made the effort, imperfectly, and with the visible strain of a man rewiring a habit of years. But the effort was real, and she respected real effort more than she respected easy results. She also told him about the Miles City supplier, and after he'd looked into it and confirmed the price difference, he switched the feed contract, and he mentioned it to her when the first delivery came in, not as a point scored, but as information shared. She understood the difference, and she took it the way it was offered. May watched all of this with the placid attention of a woman who has seen enough of the world to know when not to comment. It was on a Thursday, 3 weeks after Evelyn's arrival, that Gerald Hargrove's name came back into the room. The mail writer came in the morning. Nathan went through the correspondence in the study as he always did, and May brought coffee in and came back out and closed the door, which she did not ordinarily do. Evelyn was in the garden, pulling the last of the late carrots before the ground froze. She came in for the coffee. May had sat in the kitchen and knew immediately that something had shifted, the way you know it in a house. A change in the air, in the quality of quiet. "What happened?" she asked. May nodded toward the study. "Letter from Billings. Hargrove is back in the territory." Evelyn set down her coffee. "I thought the lawsuit resolved the legal claim, yes, but there's nothing stopping the man from being in Montana." May's face was tight, the most expression Evelyn had seen on it. "He's been gone 6 years. Now his name's showing up in Billings' correspondence." Evelyn went to the study door. She knocked. "Come in." He was sitting at the desk with the letter open in front of him. He looked the way she imagined he'd looked in the months after Hargrove, compressed, too still, the particular stillness of someone managing something that has very old roots. "May told you," he said. "She told me his name came up. What does the letter say?" He handed it to her without hesitation, which told her something about how much had changed in 3 weeks. The letter was from his attorney in Billings, a man named Frick, whose name appeared often in the correspondence she'd been helping to organize. Short, direct, the kind of letter a careful attorney writes when he wants to flag something without alarming. Hargrove has taken rooms in Billings and made inquiries at 2 land offices. Nature of inquiries not yet confirmed, but direction suggests interest in the Eastern Valley territories. You should be aware. She read it twice and put it down. The Eastern Valley territories, she said. That includes your boundary. It borders it. The parcels directly east of my eastern fence line have been unclaimed for 2 years. There was a homestead family there, the Prentice family, who left after their youngest died. The land reverted. He looked at the window. They're good parcels. Water access from the creek tributary. Anyone buying them would share my fence line on one side and the creek on the other. Could he claim the water rights? Not to my creek. My water rights are documented, like I told you. But if he bought those parcels and ran cattle on them, he'd have access to the tributary, which feeds into my grazing land. He paused. It's not a legal problem. It's a proximity problem, she said. Yes. She sat down in the chair across from the desk. She thought about what May had told her. about Hargrove, about what it had done to Nathan, about the 6 months of compression and silence that followed. She thought about the particular way someone is remade by a betrayal that comes from inside, from trust given and used against itself. And she thought about what it would mean for that person to have the source of that betrayal reappear at the edge of their property line. "What are you going to do?" she said. "I'm going to have Frick find out what Hargrove is actually after before I decide anything. Speculation isn't useful." He said it steadily, but his jaw was set in the way she'd learned meant he was working hard to keep something contained. "I'm not going to let him—" He stopped. "You're not going to let him make you small again," she said. "Inside all this space, like May said." He looked at her. "May said that." "She did." Evelyn held his gaze. "She was right, wasn't she?" A long pause. "Yes." "Then listen to me." She leaned forward. "You've spent 6 years securing everything that was vulnerable. The deeds, the water rights, the accounts. You told me yourself. Everything restructured. 4 copies in 3 locations. He cannot take what you've already protected." "He doesn't have to take anything legally to cause damage," Nathan said. "He just has to be there, on the adjacent parcel, running cattle that crowd my grazing boundary, making nuisance claims about the fence line, filing trivial complaints with the land office to create paperwork and cost, and—" He stopped himself. "That's what he'd do. Not the large theft again. He's too careful for that now. He'd do the smaller thing, the grinding thing, and he'd do it for years." She watched him. He was right. She could see the logic of it, the particular cruelty of a man who knows where the old wound is and stands next to it without touching it, just reminding you it's there. "Then we need to buy those parcels first," she said. He looked at her. "Before he can," she said. "The eastern parcels that border your fence line. If they're unclaimed, they're available. What's the process for filing on them?" "The land office in Miles City, but I'd need capital available immediately, if Hargrove's already made inquiries." "How much?" He told her. She did the arithmetic against what she'd seen in the accounts. "You have it," she said. "It would pull the reserve lower than you'd like, but it's available. And Frick could file within a week if you send the authorization today." He was very still. "You've been reviewing my accounts for 3 weeks," he said slowly. "You gave me access to them," she said. "I paid attention." He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen before. Not the watchfulness, not the managed distance. Something more unguarded than that. Something that she had the instinct to look away from and didn't. "Why?" he said. It was a simple word and it carried a considerable weight. "Why what? Why do you—" He stopped. Started again. "3 weeks ago you arrived at this ranch because a letter promised you something, and the man who wrote the letter didn't show up. You had every reason to leave. You stayed. You've been going through my accounts and noticing my feed costs and telling me when I make decisions without informing you. And now you're telling me to spend my capital reserve to block a man you've never met from buying adjacent land." He looked at her with those dark, direct eyes. "Why?" She looked at the letter on the desk, at the study window, at the bookshelf with its creased and used spines. "Because this place is worth protecting," she said. "And because you are apparently going to need someone around who thinks about things when you're too close to them to see clearly." She paused. "Also because Hargrove sounds like a person who deserves to not get what he wants." Something in his face shifted, and for a moment she thought he was going to say something that went further than their careful, practical conversations had gone, something that would move them from the territory they'd been navigating into somewhere else. He didn't. He looked back at the letter and picked up his pen. "I'll write to Frick today," he said. "Good." She stood to leave. "Evelyn?" She turned. He was looking at the pen in his hand, and, "Thank you," he said. Not the way he'd said it in the cabin, obligated and catching himself. This was different, plain and direct and costing him something. "You're welcome," she said, and went back to the garden. The letter went to Frick that afternoon. Frick, who was apparently the kind of attorney who moved fast when the situation called for it, sent word back within 4 days. He had filed on the eastern parcels on Nathan's behalf, and the filings were clean, and unless Hargrove had already been ahead of them at the Miles City Land Office, which Frick's inquiries suggested he hadn't, the claim would stand. Nathan told her at breakfast, setting the return letter on the table next to her coffee cup. She read it, folded it, handed it back. "Good," she said. He sat down across from her. May brought more coffee and went to the other end of the kitchen. Frick wants to know, Nathan said carefully, how I want the parcels filed. Whether they go under the Cole Ranch holding directly, or whether there's another option he mentioned. He stopped. What option? He looked at his coffee. He mentioned they could be filed under a joint arrangement, if there were a partnership arrangement in place. Legally, it would be more... He stopped again. He was having trouble with this sentence. She could see it. It would be more defensible, he said finally. A joint holding is harder to challenge than a sole holding when the challenge comes from someone with prior dispute history. She looked at him. He was looking at his coffee. Nathan, she said. He looked up. Is Frick suggesting this because it's legally advantageous, she said? Or are you using Frick as a way to ask me something you haven't found a direct way to ask? A pause. Both, he said. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, one of the men was working near the barn, the sound of a hammer at irregular intervals. May was at the sink, very still. Evelyn looked at her coffee. She looked at the letter folded on the table. She thought about what she'd said to herself, standing at the washstand mirror in the east-facing room that first night, that she hadn't decided anything. She thought about what she'd understood at the fire that evening, that the decision had already started forming in something that didn't ask permission. She thought about her mother, who had loved a story that wasn't real. This, she thought, was not a story. This was a difficult man in a working place who had done a dishonest thing out of fear and was still paying for it in her estimation, and who was now looking at her over a coffee cup with those steady dark eyes and waiting, without pretending not to wait, without filling the silence with noise or persuasion. Tell Frick to file them jointly, she said. Nathan's hands, on either side of his coffee cup, were very still. That's not a decision about the arrangement, she said clearly. That's a decision about the parcels. Don't make it mean more than it is right now. I won't, he said, but it means I'm staying. Yes, he said. I understand. She picked up her coffee. Tell Frick to move quickly. If Hargrove makes inquiries at Miles City and finds the filing already done, I'd like him to see both our names on it. She watched Nathan absorb that. The particular implication of it, Hargrove arriving at the land office and finding not a sole holding easily challenged, but two names on a document, a woman who had pulled a man out from under a boulder in the dark and had learned his ranch's accounts and was apparently not inclined to leave. Yes, Nathan said. He reached for his pen. She watched him write the instruction to Frick. His handwriting slanted and precise, and she thought about Blackridge Station and the rotting platform and the 12-foot boards and the split in the bench and the station keeper's face doing its complicated thing, and she thought about the 600 miles behind her and the valley ahead and the creek running clear in August like the letter said. She was not her mother. She was not inside a story that wasn't real. She was sitting at a table in a working kitchen with mud on her boots from the garden and a history of Montana territorial government half read on the shelf in the study, and outside the window the cottonwood line was turning gold. The way cottonwoods do when October starts getting serious, and none of it was smooth or certain or resolved. But it was real. That was enough. For now, that was enough. Nathan sealed the letter and set it aside for the mail rider. He looked up and found her still at the table. There's a water crossing on the southern boundary that's been silting up, he said. I was going to ride out this afternoon to look at it. You're welcome to come if you... Yes, she said before he finished. He looked almost surprised. He was, she thought, still learning that she didn't need persuading to go toward things. She either went or she didn't, and the decision was made quickly and held. She was already getting up to find her coat. The ride south that afternoon was the longest they'd taken together, 3 hours out and back. And the conversation over those hours was not about the ranch or the accounts or Gerald Hargrove or the letter arrangements. It moved through other territory, slower and less defined, the kind of talk that happens between people when they've stopped managing what they say and started just saying it. She told him about her father, not the fact of him leaving, which she'd mentioned before, but the particular memory she carried the last morning. Him at breakfast and her at 9 years old watching him and knowing, in the way children know things they can't articulate, that something was ending. She'd never told anyone that. She wasn't sure why she told him. He told her about the first year on the land before the ranch was anything. when it was just him and 2 hired men and a hard winter that took more cattle than he had money to replace. And he'd spent 3 months deciding whether to stay or go, and the deciding had been more exhausting than the work. "What made you stay?" she said. He looked at the mountains. "Stubbornness," he said, "and some idea that the land deserved someone who was going to be serious about it." "The land deserved," she said. "I know how that sounds." "It doesn't sound wrong," she said. "Just unusual." He glanced at her. "You think land can deserve things?" "I think some places have been through enough that they've earned the person who's willing to stay," she said. He was quiet for a while after that. At the water crossing, he knelt at the bank and worked at the silted channel with a stick while she held the horses, and the afternoon light went gold and long across the valley the way it had on their first ride. And she watched him work with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who understood the particular problem in front of him and wasn't performing competence, just exercising it. She thought, this is what I came for, not the letter's promise, not the security of a good house. This, a real place and a real person and work that meant something, and enough honest friction between two difficult people to keep both of them awake. She had not said she loved him. She was nowhere close to that word. But she stood at the bank of the silted creek and held the horses and watched him work. And she thought that whatever this was, it was beginning. Whatever it was becoming, she was not afraid of it. He stood and came back to take his horse from her. His hands were muddy, which he wiped on his trousers without thinking, and he looked at her with the particular expression she had begun to read as his unguarded face. Not managed, not careful, just present. "I'll have to bring 2 men out tomorrow with shovels," he said. "I'll come too," she said. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." She met his eyes. "I'll come too." He nodded, once. He was learning not to argue with that. They rode back in the long light, side by side, and the mountains held the last of the sun and then released it, and the valley went cool and blue and wide around them, and it was quiet enough that she could hear the creek. She thought about the letter, in January, in the rented room. Come west. A home. A future. A life worth living. She thought, the man who wrote that didn't know what he was offering. He'd written the words and been afraid of them and tried to check them against some test in the dark of a canyon, and he'd ended up under a rock, and she'd ended up pulling him out of it, and here they were. No story she would have written, not smooth, not resolved, but hers. She kept that thought and rode toward the lights of the ranch coming on in the early dark, and she did not look at him, but she could feel him beside her, steady and present and not pretending otherwise. And she thought, all right, all right. The shovels went into the silted crossing the next morning, and Evelyn was there like she'd said she would be. She wasn't the one digging. Nathan had 2 men for that, Dyer and a younger hand named Pruitt, who worked without complaint and without conversation, which was the combination Nathan seemed to prefer in his workers. But she managed the horses on the bank and watched the channel and told them when the water started moving better through the cleared section, which was information they couldn't see from where they were standing in the creek. It took 4 hours. When they were done, the water ran clean through, the way it was supposed to. Riding back, Pruitt said to Dyer, just loud enough that the wind almost covered it, "She came out here herself." Dyer said something back that she didn't catch, but she heard Pruitt's response. "Not what I expected," he said. She filed that away without showing she'd heard it. October deepened. The cottonwoods along the creek went from gold to bare over the space of about 10 days, and the mornings got hard and cold in a way that was different from St. Louis cold. Drier, more serious, the kind of cold that means business from the start rather than building into it. She dug the last of the garden before the ground froze. May showed her how to pack the root cellar properly, which vegetables wanted what conditions, what order things should come out across a winter. She paid attention the way she always paid attention, completely, because incomplete attention was not something she knew how to do. Nathan watched all of this. She knew he watched it. He had the quality of attention she'd noticed from the first night in the cabin. That particular focused awareness that she had initially read as calculation and now understood as something else. A man who had learned to observe carefully because the alternative, trusting too quickly, had cost him enormously, and who was discovering that observation and trust were not as mutually exclusive as he'd believed. He was also changing in small ways that she noticed and didn't point out. He told her things before he decided them more often than not. Not always. He was not a changed man. He was a man in the slow process of adjusting a habit, but often enough that she could see the effort and recognize it for what it was. He had started leaving the study door open when he worked in the evenings. It was a small thing. She understood it was not a small thing. She had not said anything about Frick's filing. The papers had been submitted and confirmed. Nathan had told her when they came through, both names on the Eastern parcels, the claim registered and clean. He'd handed her the confirmation copy and she'd read it and folded it and put it in the drawer of the writing desk in her room. Her room, she'd started calling it that, and she noticed when she did and kept doing it, and that had been that. She told herself she was still watching. She was. But the watching had changed character. Early on, it had been the watching of someone deciding whether to stay. Now it was the watching of someone who had stayed and was learning the shape of the place she'd stayed in. There is a difference. It took her a while to admit it was real. The letter from Hargrove arrived on a Wednesday. It came through Frick's office, forwarded with a cover note from the attorney that said, in his careful dry prose, "I thought you should see this before it arrives through any other channel. I have no immediate legal concern, but the tone warrants your awareness." Nathan brought it to the kitchen table at breakfast, which was itself a change. 6 weeks ago, he would have taken it to the study and dealt with it alone and informed her afterward, if at all. He set it next to the bread plate and she read it while she drank her coffee. Hargrove's letter was addressed to Nathan directly. It was civil in the particular way that holds hostility underneath, the way a frozen river is civil. Smooth on top, moving hard underneath. He wrote that he had returned to the territory on private business, and that he was aware of the Eastern parcel filings. He wrote that he held no ill will from the events of 6 years past, and hoped Nathan felt the same. He wrote that he was interested in discussing certain matters of mutual interest, should Nathan be amenable to a meeting. Mutual interest. Evelyn read it twice. "He's testing the water," she said. "Yes. He wants to know if the filing scared you or if you'll respond. If I respond to his letter, that's information for him. If I don't respond, that's also information." "What does Frick say?" "Frick says acknowledge receipt, give nothing else, and let him make the next move." He turned his coffee cup on the table, the small rotating motion she recognized as his thinking gesture. "I'm inclined to agree with him." "I'm not," she said. He looked at her. Acknowledging receipt gives him a response, which he can read as uncertainty. Silence gives him a gap to fill with whatever interpretation benefits him. She set the letter down. "I think you should write back directly, short, not hostile, simply—" She paused, finding the right weight. "Tell him the parcel filings are finalized, that you wish him well in his private business, and that you don't anticipate matters of mutual interest at this time. No door open, no door slammed, just a clear wall with a polite face on it." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "You've thought about this kind of thing before," he said. "I dealt with the laundry owner for 7 years after my mother couldn't. He was a man who used every gap you left him." She looked at the letter. "Men like that, the ones who come back after they've already done damage, they're not looking for a fight. They're looking for an opening. You close the openings and they move on to easier ground." He looked at the letter, then at her. Something in his expression, in this particular light, at this particular moment, was entirely unmanaged. Not the dark eyes making a careful calculation, just a man at a kitchen table early in the morning being looked at clearly. "All right," he said. "Will you help me write it?" She reached for the pen on the side table. They wrote it together, him with the words he wanted to use, her shaping them toward the precise quality she was after, neither of them quite getting what they'd started with, and the result being better than either draft. It took 40 minutes and 2 full false starts, and 1 moment where they disagreed sharply about a specific phrase. He wanted something that made the boundary clear, and she thought it tipped from firm into aggressive and invited a return volley. And in the end, she was right, and he said so, which cost him visibly, and she appreciated that he did it anyway. The letter went out with the mail rider that afternoon. Hargrove did not write back. 3 weeks later, Frick sent word that Hargrove had left Billings. Destination unknown, but the territory inquiries had stopped and his rooms had been vacated. Frick noted, with the understated satisfaction of a careful attorney who likes to be proven correct, that the filing strategy appeared to have been effective. Nathan read the letter at the desk in the study, and Evelyn was there because she had been going through the winter feed projections and had found a number that didn't reconcile with the August inventory, and he read it and handed it to her without saying anything, and she read it and handed it back and went back to the inventory. After a minute, he said, "Thank you." She didn't look up. "You're welcome." Another minute passed. "Evelyn." She looked up. He had turned in the chair and was looking at her with the expression she had first seen clearly that evening by the fire when she told him he would not get to run experiments on her. The exposed look, the look that cost something. "I need to say something," he said. "All right." "I have not been—" He stopped. He looked at the pen in his hand and set it down. "I have not been fair to you, from the beginning. I didn't meet you at the station. I lied about my name for hours while you gave me your last food and tore up your dress for bandages. I tested you with the canyon and the cabin and then kept testing you, in smaller ways here. Even the accounts, watching to see how you'd handle them. What you'd do with the access." He looked at the window. "I have been keeping a running assessment of you for 2 months, and I know how that sounds, and I know what it means about me, and I don't have a version of this where that was acceptable." The study was quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the bare cottonwoods. She put down her pencil. "I know," she said. "You know, and you stayed." "I know and I stayed," she said, "because I could also see why. Not as an excuse, it's not an excuse. But I understand the architecture of it. Hargrove built it. You just kept living inside it after he was gone." He looked at her steadily. "That doesn't make it right." "No," she said. "It doesn't. I'm not telling you it does. I'm telling you I understood it, and I chose to stay anyway, and those are two separate things that can both be true." She picked the pencil back up. "The assessment you've been running, what's your conclusion?" He was quiet for a long moment. "That you're the most honest person I've ever had in this house," he said, "and the most—" He paused. "Formidable. That's the word I keep coming back to. Not as a criticism." She almost smiled. "I know it's not." "What are you trying to say?" "Not the assessment, the thing underneath it." He looked at his hands, at the desk, at the window, at her. "I'd like this to be real," he said. "Not the arrangement, not the letter terms. I'd like—" He stopped. "I know I'm not easy to be with. I know I've done things that have earned a considerable amount of your reasonable distrust. I know that what I'm asking for is more than I have a right to ask for at this point." He held her gaze and didn't look away. "I'd like to try, if you're willing, properly. Not a test, not an assessment, just two people trying." The fire in the study grate had gone low. The winter wind pressed against the window glass with the steady persistence of weather that has settled in for the duration. She thought about her mother's ring on her right hand, the thin gold band and the chip of garnet she hadn't been able to sell. She thought about the rented room and the sound of steam through the floor and the laundry smell that got into everything. She thought about the platform at Blackridge Station, 12 feet wide and rotting at the edges, and the train disappearing around the curve of the mountain, and the cold particular certainty of being left standing alone. She thought about the canyon in the dark, and the horse shaking against the rock wall, and the man pinned under the boulder who'd watched her with those dark, focused eyes from the moment she knelt beside him, like someone memorizing something they were afraid of losing. She thought about what she'd told him early on, that she'd come west not because she wanted to be managed by someone else's wealth, but because the letter had sounded like plain speaking, and she was tired of the alternative. He was speaking plainly now. She could hear the cost of it in every sentence. "I'm already trying," she said. "I have been for 2 months." He looked at her. "I'm not saying it's resolved," she said. "I'm not saying we're past all of it. Some of it I'll have to keep deciding about, probably for a long time." She held his gaze. "But I'm trying. And if you're trying too, then that's what we have." The thing that moved across his face then was not the managed blankness or the careful watchfulness or even the exposed look she'd seen before. It was simpler than any of those things. It was relief. The specific relief of someone who has been holding something for a long time in cold hands and has been allowed to set it down. "All right," he said. "All right," she said, and went back to the inventory. But she was smiling at the numbers, and she let herself do that. November came in hard and stayed hard. The ranch contracted into its winter shape, fewer hands, shorter days, the work turning inward toward maintenance and preparation rather than expansion. She learned the rhythms of it the way she'd learned everything, by watching first and then doing, and by asking questions that she'd discovered Nathan answered completely when she asked them directly, which was most of the time now. May observed all of this with her steady composure and said less than she knew, which Evelyn had come to understand was May's highest expression of approval. There was an evening in the second week of November when the snow came down for the first time. Real snow, not the early fringe that had dusted the ground twice already and melted by afternoon, but the kind that means it, thick and quiet and turning the valley white within 2 hours. Evelyn stood at the kitchen window and watched it come, and she heard Nathan behind her and didn't turn around, and they both watched it for a while. "First winter here?" he said. "First winter anywhere that felt like this," she said. He didn't ask what she meant. She thought he understood. He moved to stand beside her at the window, close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him in the cold kitchen, and they watched the snow cover the yard and the cottonwoods and the barn roof and the valley beyond in the slow, patient accumulation of winter doing what winter does. And the house was warm behind them, and the lamps were lit against the early dark, and she thought, this is it. This is the thing I came for and could not have named. She found his hand beside hers on the windowsill. She covered it with hers without looking at him, without saying anything. He turned his hand over and held hers back, and that was all, and it was sufficient. They stood there until the snow had covered everything they could see. December brought a problem she hadn't anticipated. She'd been writing letters. Not to anyone at the ranch, to the few people in St. Louis she'd kept in loose contact with. A woman named Clara, who'd worked the laundry counter and had been a kind of friend in the sideways fashion that busy people form friendships. Clara wrote back in early December with news that was practical and painful at once. The building that housed the laundry and the rooms above it had been sold. The new owner was raising rents by a third. An older woman named Mrs. Dodd, who had nowhere else to go and no family nearby, was going to be turned out at the end of January. Evelyn read the letter twice. She folded it. She put it in her coat pocket and went to find Nathan. I was in the barn, working with Dyer on a harness that had snapped in the cold. She waited until Dyer stepped away and then she said, "I need to talk to you about something." He looked at her face and handed the harness to Pruitt and came over. She told him about Mrs. Dodd, about the building, about January. Clearly, without editorializing, just the facts and what they meant. He was quiet for a moment. "What are you asking?" "I'm not asking yet," she said. "I'm telling you first, the way you said you'd tell me before you decide." He understood that. She saw him take it in. "What do you want to do?" he said. "I want to know if there's a way to help her. If she'd come here, not to the main house, but there's the old foreman's cottage on the south end of the property. It's empty. It needs work, but it's a building. If someone were willing to let her stay there in exchange for what she could offer, she's a good seamstress. She kept those rooms in order for 15 years. "Yes," he said. She blinked. "I haven't finished explaining." "You've explained enough." He looked at the barn door, at the white outside. "There's wood for the cottage stove. Dyer can get the roof sound before January. Write to your friend and tell Mrs. Dodd there's a place here if she wants it." She looked at him for a moment. She had expected him to weigh it, to ask careful questions, to want more information before committing. He had simply not done any of that, and she was going to have to stop expecting the old version of him to show up, because the old version had been leaving by degrees since October, and she needed to let it go. "All right," she said, "write today. If she's coming, she should come before the January cold gets worse." She wrote that afternoon, and Clara wrote back within the week. And by the third week of December, a small woman in her 60s with a cloth bag and a sewing box, and the particular careful dignity of someone who has been through difficulty and refused to let it diminish her, arrived at the coal ranch on the supply wagon from Miles City. Her name was Margaret Dodd, and she had a direct gaze and a handshake that was firmer than her slight frame suggested. And she looked at the cottage with its new roof boards and its warm stove and said, "It'll do very well, thank you." She was settled in within a day. By the end of the week, she had patched 4 of the ranch hands' work coats without being asked. Nathan watched this happen from the periphery. At supper one evening, after Margaret had eaten with them and returned to the cottage, he said, "You were right about her." "I usually am," Evelyn said. May made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. Nathan looked like he was reconsidering his position on several things simultaneously. January was quiet and deep and white. The ranch ran on the slower winter cadence. More time indoors, more time at the table, more evenings in the front room with the fire and the lamps, and the particular intimacy that a cold house forces on the people inside it. She and Nathan had found their way to talking in the evenings the way she hadn't entirely expected. Not about ranch business, though that came up. About other things. About what they'd read. About things they'd seen and thought and never quite said to anyone. He was, she discovered, a reader of history and of accounts of exploration, not in a romantic way, but in the way of someone trying to understand how things actually work, how places came to be what they were. She told him she'd read everything she could find as a child, not because she loved all of it, but because the room she grew up in was small, and books were the only way it got larger. He said, "That's why you came west." She thought about it. Partly. The room was still too small. She looked at the fire. Yes. He didn't say anything else about it, and she didn't need him to. One evening, near the end of January, she put down the book and said, "I need to tell you something." He looked up from his newspaper. "When I came west," she said, "I told you my reasons. The security, the plain speaking. I told you about my mother and why I wanted something with clear terms rather than a story." She looked at the fire. "I left out one thing." He waited. "I was afraid," she said. "That's the part I left out. Not of the frontier, not of the practical risks, of the personal part. The actual—" She stopped. "My father left, and then my mother spent 11 years in a story that wasn't real, and she died of it, basically. And I told myself I was different, that I was practical, that I'd go into an arrangement with clear terms and no illusions. But the truth is, I was just afraid of the illusions. Afraid of wanting something that wasn't real. Afraid of—" She stopped again. "Trusting someone with the real thing," he said. She looked at him. "And having them leave," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Yes." He set down his newspaper. He sat forward, elbows on knees, hands loosely linked. "I know what that is," he said. "Not in the same shape as yours, but the thing underneath it. The reason I don't trust quickly. The reason I tested you when I should have just met you at the station like I said I would." He looked at his hands. "Hargrove didn't just take property. He took my ability to believe my own judgment, which is the thing that had gotten me everything I'd built. And when you lose faith in your own judgment, you stop trusting anyone else's, including the voice in your own chest telling you that someone is worth trusting. Your instinct about me," she said, "which you had from the letter." "Which I had from the letter," he said, "and ignored, and put under a rock, so to speak, and built a test around instead of just meeting you at the station." She looked at the fire for a long moment. "We're both people who were burned," she said, "and both of us came into this looking for a way to want something without getting hurt by it." "Yes." "And there isn't one," she said. "That's what I've understood this winter. There isn't a structure you can build around wanting something that makes it safe. You either want it and live with the risk, or you don't want it and you're safe and you're also—" She paused. "Alone. Inside a small room." He looked at her with that steady, unguarded look that she had come to know as his most honest face. "I don't want to be alone inside a small room," she said. "Neither do I," he said. "Then I think we should stop treating this like an arrangement with terms," she said, "and start treating it like what it actually is." He was very still. "Which is?" "Two people who are poorly suited to being easy," she said, "but who are apparently suited to each other, in the specific ways that matter." He got up from his chair. He crossed the room and sat down beside her, close but not presumptuous, and he looked at her the way he'd looked at her the first night in the cabin, like someone memorizing something they were afraid of losing. "I love you," he'd said. "I'm aware that comes out roughly, and I'm aware I have not made it easy to get here, and I'm aware there's an argument that I haven't earned the right to say it yet, but I'd rather say it plainly than manage how it sounds." She put her hand on his face. He went very still, the way he always did when something surprised him. The total stillness of a man whose first instinct is to observe, even when what he is observing is something being given to him. "I love you too," she said, "and I'm going to keep telling you when you're wrong. I'm going to keep doing the accounts. I'm going to invite people to that cottage without always asking first. I am not going to be easy to live with." "I know," he said. "I need you to actually know it, not just say it." "Evelyn." His voice was rough in the way of someone holding something carefully. "I watched you pull me out from under a boulder. I watched you tear your last dry dress into bandages. I watched you tell a man twice your age he was wrong and stand there until he corrected it. I know who you are. He held her gaze. I am not under any illusions. She held his gaze for one more moment. All right, she said. He kissed her, and it was not smooth or cinematic. It was two people who had been careful for too long deciding to stop being careful, and it was real and imperfect and exactly sufficient. May, who had been in the hallway attending to something important that kept her just out of sight, went back to the kitchen with an expression she would not describe to anyone and did not need to. They were married in March, when the snow had pulled back from the valley floor and the first grass was coming up along the creek. A justice of the peace from Miles City, May and Dyer as witnesses, Margaret Dodd near the back in a good dress she had mended herself, Pruitt and two other hands along the wall in their clean shirts. Small and plain and real, which was the only kind of thing Evelyn had ever trusted. She wore her mother's ring moved to her left hand. She had not replaced it or added to it. Thin gold, a chip of garnet, and it had gone everywhere her mother had gone, and now it had gone further than her mother ever had. Nathan said his vows the way he said everything that mattered, precisely, without ornamentation, meaning each word entirely. She said hers the same way. When it was done, Dyer clapped once, with great practicality, and Pruitt did the same. Margaret Dodd wept quietly and without apology. Afterward, she said to Evelyn, "Your mother would have liked this." Evelyn said, "She would have liked him. It would have taken her a while." Margaret said, "That's how it should be." And they left it there, which was the right place to leave it. Spring arrived on its own schedule, which on a frontier ranch means it arrives slowly and with complications. The cattle came down from winter range and needed assessment. 3 cows lost to weather. 1 hand quit without much notice, required replacing. The new eastern parcels needed their fence lines walked and 2 sections repaired where frost had heaved the posts. She walked it with Nathan and Dyer over 2 days, learning the shape of the new land the way she'd learned the old, by moving across it and paying attention to what it told you. Hargrove's name did not come up again that spring. Frick sent a letter in April noting that a man matching his description had been seen in Wyoming, 3 territories east, which suggested he'd received the message that the coal ranch was not loose ground to work at. She filed the letter in the correspondence drawer and went back to the supply projections without spending more thought on it. Some problems resolve themselves when you stop leaving gaps in them. That had been true of the laundry owner, and it had been true of Hargrove, and she suspected it was true of most men who operated by finding weakness rather than building strength. In May, she wrote to an employment agency in Billings and put forward a proposal for additional help on the ranch as the eastern parcel operations expanded. She wrote the letter and showed it to Nathan before she sent it. He read it. "You're hiring someone." "We're hiring someone," she said. "I'm proposing it to you first." He looked at the letter again. At her. Then back at the letter. "Send it," he said. She sent it. The woman who came in June was named Ruth Halsey, 23 years old, from a farm family in the Dakotas, and she arrived with calloused hands and no fear of physical work and a dry wit that took the ranch hands approximately 4 days to appreciate and then another 2 weeks to stop being slightly afraid of. She was exactly what the operation needed, which Evelyn had assessed from the 3 sentences Ruth had written in her response letter, and which Nathan, to his credit, accepted without requiring proof first. That, too, was a change, she noted. He was extending trust more readily now, not recklessly, but with less lag. Watching for actual warning signs rather than treating every unfamiliar person as a potential Hargrove. It was not a complete transformation. He was still fundamentally a careful man, and she didn't want to change that, because careful and closed were different things and careful was worth keeping. But the closed part had been receding since January, and she didn't think it was coming back. The summer came in hard and bright and full of work, the kind of summer a working ranch produces in abundance. Long days, physical exhaustion, problems that needed solving and got solved and were replaced by new ones, the continuous forward motion of an operation that is alive and therefore always demanding. She found she was not tired by this. She had expected at some point to feel the strain of it, the relentlessness of ranch life that she had read about and been warned about. What she found instead was that she had been made for relentlessness. The rented room, the laundry accounting, the 7 years of managing a situation that was always slightly more than she should have had to manage. All of that had been preparation for this. She just hadn't known what she was being prepared for. She became known in the way that people become known in small communities across wide distances through the specific currency of reputation that travels by word of mouth along supply routes and market roads and the occasional gathering at the county seat. The woman at the Cole Ranch, the one who'd come from St. Louis on the letter arrangement and stayed, the one who'd reorganized the feed contracts and added the eastern parcels and brought a seamstress from Missouri and hired the Halsey girl, the one who could look at a set of accounts and find what didn't add up, which in country full of men doing business on handshakes and memory was not a small thing. She heard about her own reputation occasionally, filtered through May or through something Dyer let slip, and she didn't think much about it. She was not interested in being known. She was interested in the work in front of her and the person beside her and the place she had chosen, and that had, in its own way, chosen her. But the knowing happened anyway, the way things happen in communities when someone earns a place in them through plain action rather than performance. On a Thursday in late July, a woman rode up the valley road alone on a gray horse, which was unusual enough that Dyer watched her come for a full minute before going to the main house to say so. She was perhaps 40, well-dressed for the territory, with the bearing of a woman who had made her own decisions for a long time. Her name was Louise Petrie, and she was the wife of a rancher 40 miles north, and she had ridden 40 miles alone because she had a problem and had heard that the woman at the Cole Ranch was someone worth talking to. Her problem was a contract. Her husband had signed a grazing agreement with a neighboring operator 2 years ago, and the terms had been written vaguely, deliberately vaguely, she now believed. And the neighboring operator was now interpreting the vagueness in a way that was eating into the Petrie cattle's summer range. Her husband was ill. She was managing the operation. The neighboring operator had made it clear he did not consider her a party to the negotiation and would not deal with her directly. She told all of this standing in the kitchen, having refused a chair, with the directness of a woman who had not ridden 40 miles to be made comfortable. Evelyn listened to the whole of it without interrupting. "Do you have this contract?" she said. "I have a copy." "May I read it?" Louise Petrie produced it from her coat. Evelyn read it twice, the way she read things that mattered. She set it on the table. "The vagueness is in the boundary description," she said. "He used natural landmarks, the rock formation on the North Creek Bend, the old fire line. Those shift. The rock's been moved by 2 spring floods since this was written, probably. Which means the boundary he's claiming now has shifted with it, which is exactly what he intended." She looked at Louise. "You need a surveyor to establish the pre-contract boundary using historical records, and you need Frick, or someone like Frick, to file the documented measurement against the operator's current claim. Once you have the measurement on record, his interpretation becomes a falsifiable claim rather than a subjective one, and it gets considerably harder to defend." Louise Petrie looked at her for a long moment. "You read that in one reading." "I've been doing accounts for 20 years, Evelyn said. "Numbers and words follow the same logic. Ambiguity is always intentional." "Will you write down what you just told me, so I have it exactly?" "I'll do better than that. I'll write to Frick on your behalf explaining what I read and what I believe the legal avenue is. You can take the letter to whatever attorney you work with, and they can pursue it from there." She wrote the letter that afternoon, Nathan at the desk beside her working on his own correspondence, neither of them speaking much, but both of them present in the particular comfortable way of people who have stopped needing to fill space with performance. When Louise Petrie rode back north with the letter in her coat, May stood at the kitchen window and watched her go. "You didn't have to do that," May said. "She rode 40 miles alone," Evelyn said. "And she was right. That contract was written to cheat her." "I know," May said. "I'm not saying you were wrong to help. I'm saying you didn't have to." She turned. "You chose to." Evelyn looked at the window. "Yes," she said. May nodded once, the way she nodded when something confirmed a thing she already knew, and went back to the stove. Louise Petrie's problem was resolved by October, which Frick reported in a letter noting that the surveyor's documentation had settled the boundary question and the neighboring operator had withdrawn his interpretation without filing a counter-challenge. Louise wrote a brief letter of thanks that was composed with the same economy she'd walked into the kitchen with, which Evelyn respected. She did not think of it as a notable thing that she'd done. She thought of it as a problem that had a solution, and she had seen the solution, and there had been no reason not to say so. But word travels in small communities, and by the time the first frost came in September, There had been two more women who'd ridden out to the coal ranch with problems of the practical kind, one with a water rights dispute and one with an estate question after her husband's death that the local men of business had explained to her as unsolvable, which it was not. It just required a specific filing that nobody had bothered to tell her about. Evelyn read each situation and wrote each letter and sent each woman back with something more useful than she'd arrived with. Nathan watched all of this the way he watched things, from a slight remove with that full and particular attention. One evening, after the second woman had come and gone, he said, "You know you're becoming something in this county." "I'm not trying to become something," she said. "I know that. That's the part that makes it work." She looked at him. "Is it a problem? For you?" He looked genuinely surprised by this question. "No," he said. "Why would it be?" She held his gaze. "Some men don't like it when the woman in their house is known for something." "I'm not some men," he said. And then more quietly, "I know you know that." She did know that. She was still occasionally in the habit of preparing for resistance that didn't arrive, which was its own kind of leftover from the life before. The laundry owner, her father, the various men who'd managed her circumstances from outside them and hadn't asked her opinion. She was like Nathan with his trust, in the process of adjusting a habit. They were both works in progress. That was all right. She had stopped believing that people who were works in progress were lesser than the people who had it figured out, because she had begun to understand that nobody had it figured out. They were all just doing it with varying degrees of honesty about that fact. The second autumn on the ranch was different from the first in the way that second things are always different. Not better or worse necessarily, but known. She knew the shape of the cottonwoods going gold now and was not surprised by it. She knew where the drafts came in the house in November and had already stuffed the worst one with cloth. She knew which hands needed what kind of direction and which ones you left alone to work. She knew the creek in all its moods and the way the mountains held clouds against them in certain kinds of weather and released them in others. She knew Nathan. Not entirely. She was not certain you ever knew a person entirely, and she was not certain she'd want to, because people who surprised you still were people who were still growing, and she wanted to be with someone who was still growing. But she knew the shapes of him, the places where he was genuinely changed, and the places where the old habits still lived and came out when he was tired or stressed or blindsided by something. She knew when to push and when to wait, and she knew the difference between the kind of silence that needed filling and the kind that needed to be left alone. He knew her the same way. She knew he did because he showed it, not in the announced way, not in declarations or demonstrations, but in the small continuous evidence of someone who has been paying genuine attention. He handed her things before she reached for them. He left the study door open and moved the lamp toward her side of the desk when she came to work in there. He argued with her and knew when to stop arguing and knew the difference between the moments when she needed to win and the moments when she needed to be heard, and those were not always the same thing. On a morning in late October, the second autumn, she woke early in the east-facing room. Their room. It was their room. She had stopped noting the word. And lay in the not-quite light, listening to the ranch come awake. The sounds were ordinary and entirely specific to this place. The horses in the barn, Dyer crossing the yard on his way to the cookhouse, the sound of Ruth Halsey already working somewhere she shouldn't have to be working quite that early, Margaret Dodd's lamp going on in the cottage, visible as a yellow rectangle through the window. Nathan was still asleep beside her, which was rare. He was generally up before her, a habit of 11 years of running the ranch alone. And she lay there and looked at the ceiling and thought, with the particular clarity that comes in the moments before the day begins its claims on you, about what she had come here to find. She had told herself so many things in January, in the rented room. Security, plain speaking, clear terms, a life organized around honesty rather than stories. All of that was true and none of it was the whole truth. The whole truth was simpler and harder to say. She had wanted to matter. Not to be known or valued or appreciated in the abstract, but to be a person whose presence in a specific place made a specific difference, and to know that the difference was real because she could see it. She mattered here. She could see it every day. In the accounts, in the letters she wrote for women who needed them, in the eastern parcels with both names on the deed, in the cottage with its warm stove and Margaret Dodd's lamp burning in the early dark, in the 6 hands who worked this ranch and knew they'd be paid on time and fairly, in the water crossing that ran clear because she'd been there to say when it was clear enough. None of it was grand. None of it was the kind of thing that gets written down in papers or announced at county gatherings. It was the steady, accumulative work of being genuinely present in a place and letting that presence be useful. Her mother had been that in the laundry for 11 years, for a man who wasn't there and didn't see it and wouldn't have appreciated it if he had. She had given a real and capable presence to a situation that didn't deserve it and been diminished by the giving and died tired. Evelyn had given the same presence to a place that was real and a person who was genuinely trying to deserve it, and she was not diminished. She was, if anything, more entirely herself than she had been at any point she could remember. That was the thing she would have told the woman in the rented room in January, if she could have found the words for it then. You are not going west to find something you lack. You are going west to find a place large enough to hold what you already are. She turned and looked at Nathan, awake now, watching her with those dark eyes that had watched her since the canyon floor. What are you thinking about? He said. My mother, she said. He waited. She gave everything she had to someone who left, she said. And I spent a long time being afraid I'd do the same thing. She looked at the ceiling. I think I understand now that the difference isn't in finding someone who won't leave. The difference is in knowing what you're giving and choosing to give it anyway because the thing you're giving it to is worth it. He was quiet for a moment. And, he said. He knew her well enough to know there was an and. And you're worth it, she said. That's all. You're worth it. She heard the breath he let out, slow and deliberate, the held thing releasing, the same relief she'd seen on his face in the study in November, but quieter now, deeper in. So are you, he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the ceiling too now, and his profile in the early light was familiar in the way that a landscape becomes familiar after you've lived inside it long enough. Not possessible, not reduced, but known, and the knowing itself a kind of love. Outside, the ranch was fully awake now. The day was beginning its claims. There was work to do, as there always was, and they would get up and do it, as they always did, because that was what this life was. The continuous daily choosing of the work and the place and the person beside you, not once in a letter or once at an altar, but every ordinary morning in the light before the day. She got up. She went to the window and looked out at the valley, at the cottonwoods past their gold and into the bare gray of late October, at the mountains holding their first snow on the highest ridges, at the creek catching the early light in its bends, running clear the way it always ran, cold and clear even this late in the year. A woman she hadn't been a year ago stood at the window of a house that was hers, in a valley she had walked into in the dark, in a life she had built from the wreckage of a promise that turned out to be real after all, just not in the shape it had been offered. She dressed and went downstairs. May was already in the kitchen. The fire was going and the coffee was made, and outside Dyer was crossing the yard, and Ruth Halsey was at the barn, and Margaret Dodd's smoke was rising from the cottage chimney straight up in the still morning air, which meant the day was going to be clear. She poured her coffee and stood at the window and watched the day begin. This was what courage looked like from the inside. Not the canyon in the dark, not the rope and the boulder and the hour through the rain, though those things had been part of it. This, the ordinary morning, the chosen life, the willingness to keep choosing it every day with full knowledge of what it was. She had crossed 600 miles for a promise and found something truer than the promise. She had walked into the dark and come out knowing where she was. She stood in her kitchen on an October morning in a valley in Montana and drank her coffee and watched the light come fully into the world, and she did not look away from any of it. It was hers, all of it. She had earned it the only way anything real gets earned, by showing up, staying in, and refusing to leave when leaving would have been easier. And the creek ran below the cottonwoods, clear even in October, the way the letter had promised. That was the last thing she'd needed to know.